All right, Congressman, first of all, as always, thank you so much for taking some time with us. Where are we today on the debt ceiling issue?
I expect that the plan that President Biden, Speaker McCarthy negotiated will pass. I'm not going to vote for it. I'm frankly spending this time lobbying my colleagues to vote against it because I am uncomfortable with a debt limit that is just suspended with no upper cap. And to me, a lot of the talking points like work requirements and COVID rescissions and administrative constraints aren't really borne out when the real language of the bill is reviewed. A lot of those things are optional or waivable or don't really last the duration of a two-year budget deal.
Let's talk about one of the things I know you have been talking about for some time, and that being the work requirement. You're mentioning that you don't think this is something that will be borne out. What is your big issue with that? What part of that do you feel will not be borne out? And what more would you like to see?
Yeah, the work requirements I sought were broad-based. They dealt with TANF, they dealt with Medicaid, and you don't see that in this legislation. This is restricted to SNAP. And the Congressional Budget Office, which is not controlled by Republicans or Democrats, it's a bipartisan entity, they analyzed that the changes in this bill would actually increase the cost of SNAP, not decrease it, because they would be enhanced eligibility for some classes of folks. And that enhanced eligibility would increase the enrollment in SNAP by 74,000 people every month. So I thought work requirements existed to get people off of government welfare and into the workforce, not to lead to a net increase in 74,000 Americans every month being on the government dole.
All right, let's get to the nuts and bolts of this, sticking specifically with this issue. Which individuals would you require to go to work? Specifically, what would you have in the bill?
Yeah, I believe that work requirements should apply to able-bodied childless adults who have received Medicaid through the Medicaid expansion from Obamacare. That's where you get tens of billions of dollars in savings immediately, hundreds of billions over a 10-year budget window. That doesn't include seniors, it doesn't include the disabled, it doesn't include single moms, but it would increase workforce participation to a far greater degree than the reforms we're seeing now, which are just on SNAP or the food stamps program. And there are existing work requirements there. This decreases the waivability of some of those, but again, it drills a hole at the bottom of the bucket and creates all of this additional financial enduring burden on that SNAP program.
All right, let's move on to another issue where you
I lost you there, Sue. Hello?
Yes, you mentioned what's another issue for you? You mentioned the work requirement. What else is a sticking point for you?
I'm also concerned that there is no cap on the amount of debt that can be accrued during this two-year period of time. The House bill that previously passed allowed for a $1.5 trillion increase in the debt limit or a date certain. Here, there's just an overall suspension of the debt limit. And the reason that concerns me with the Biden administration is we've seen them take unilateral action, like on the student loan issue, for example, that financially burdens the U.S. Treasury without even a vote of the Congress. So one of the few things we have as a check for downward pressure on spending is the debt limit. And if you merely suspend it without putting a cap on it, my worry then is that we'll see the dollar diminished and inflation increase.
There are people on the other side of the aisle, if you would, who say that part of this debt that we are having to pay down right now is debt that was incurred under the Trump administration for the cuts in taxes on the wealthy. How do you respond to that?
I never voted to raise the debt limit under President Trump or President Biden. I have been consistent on this point because I think it's a fair criticism of really the last half century in Washington under both parties that no one is really ever responsible for the national debt. We create this mystified system where everybody's allowed to blame somebody else. But what I know is the credit bill is reached. The credit limit is reached. And when that happens, it is an appropriate time to talk about some of our spending. I think we need deep vertical cuts in unauthorized federal entities, for example, at the Department of Education and the Department of Labor. But we never seem to have those discussions. And I was critical of the budgets that the Congress embraced during the Trump era. I voted against virtually all of them. And it's my hope that we're able to get some sort of bipartisan consensus that we can't continue to spend this way, or Social Security will be in jeopardy, Medicare will be in jeopardy, and really the US dollar as the global reserve currency will be more threatened than at any other time in our lives.
When you talk about the cuts that would be necessary, some of those cuts are things that would really end up hurting John Q. Citizen, average people. How do you make that palatable? How do you sell that to the general public? What do you say to people?
Well, I would probably point them to their current conditions, where what's really hurting people in Northwest Florida and throughout the country is inflation. That dollar doesn't go as far because the federal government is willing to print them irresponsibly and then hand those dollars out in the absence of some pathway to sustainability and I think self-determination in a lot of ways. And so I believe that with a lot of these federal programs, we are substituting for the role of the states. And if we had the states as the great laboratories of democracy, trying and testing different things, we would be less homogenous. Now, a lot of state legislatures can't have their own work requirements or cannot have their own changes to their nutrition programs because they have to meet federal criteria to draw down the federal dollar. So I think that creates a real erosion of the federal system. And like we're seeing in everyone's family budgets now, the dollars that you're getting from your job and from your wages are not keeping up with the pace of rising energy costs and rising inflation. And these things are interconnected.
When you say these things, so much of it seems to be common sense and things that maybe we could all sit around the table and okay, yeah, that makes sense to me. Why do we end up getting to the 11.5 hour and have this discussion? Why do we get to the brink and have this kind of discussion as opposed to having it very early on? Can't we come to the table? How do we get here?
It's a great point. And unfortunately, the muscle memory of the United States Congress is to establish brinksmanship and then drive the country to the edge of that to create the requisite political pressure for avoidance. And that's something that Joe Biden has participated in during all of his time as a senator, vice president, and even now. Let me give Speaker McCarthy this credit. He was willing immediately upon assuming the speaker's gavel to begin these negotiations, to talk through these issues. And President Biden waited 97 days before even really engaging in a sincere discussion. So I think that probably hurt the overall product that we had. But here's one thing I do know. The concessions that I got along with my colleagues in January for Kevin McCarthy to become speaker, like having conservatives in the appropriations process, like having 72 hours to read the bill, we are bearing some of the fruit of that now because we don't just have overnight to look at some, multi-thousand page piece of legislation. We're able to comb through a sensible amount of content and we're able to ascertain what the practical outcomes are because we have the 72 hours to review it. And as I've reviewed this, the talking points and the PowerPoint to pitch the bill, it doesn't really match up with the substance of the bill. Even the COVID rescissions, Sue, they don't even go back to the Treasury. They go back to the Department of Commerce. And that's the type of budgetary sleight of hand that really precludes me from being able to vote for it.
All right, you say you're going to vote against it. You're standing on principle to do that. Yet you say this is going to pass. Standing on principle is one thing, but you know it's going to pass. Shouldn't everybody be standing on principle with this thing?
Well, I'm not going to vote for it. I'm working both before and after our discussion now to try to convince more of my colleagues not to vote for it. If the speaker is able to get a majority of the majority to vote for it, he will bring it to the floor. And my suspicion is a lot of Democrats are going to vote for this because it it really sets cement around some of the Biden policies that they are very proud of. And so we'll have that coalition supporting it. I will not be among them, but just because something is going to pass doesn't really inform my vote. I vote the way I think Northwest Florida's interests will best be reflected. There was a legislative package I supported of 507 bills to actually create deep vertical cuts in agencies. After the debt limit passes, I will turn to try to make more of those cuts a reality in the appropriations process, so we get rid of some of the fraud, waste, and abuse in federal spending and slim this thing out. Just because the debt limit will be suspended doesn't mean we have to always reach that suspended limit. We could still undertake other efforts to try to tighten the belt here in Washington. And that's what I'll be working on, even if this does pass over my objections.
And that was going to be my next question for you. What comes after this? What is tomorrow? What is on your plate tomorrow?
Well, in addition to that appropriations process I just talked about, we do have an evolving story regarding the FBI director, an unwillingness to turn over evidence to Congress regarding some of the investigative work into the Biden family. We have a great interest in that information. We think it informs on our oversight work. And so very quickly, we may be bringing a contempt resolution to the floor regarding the FBI director for not providing records that we've sought.
All right, Congressman, anything else that you have for your constituents before we let you go?
I just wish I was there on a beautiful Northwest Florida beach instead of here in Washington, but I know it's important work and it'll likely inform on the economic conditions of the country for the next decade. So we want to get it right.
All right. And Congressman, as always, we do thank you for your time. We appreciate you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue.